Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you back once more to the Invisible College. And got an interesting lecture for you today called The Three Ways. But before I go into that, I just got a couple of announcements to make. First one is that after a lot of deliberation and consideration, I've decided to leave Facebook. In fact, I've already left it. The last straw for me was the attitude of Facebook towards Australia in particular. Why this Californian tech company should think that they could order around the Australian government about what goes on in Australia, I've got no idea, but it just indicates just how arrogant these people have become. And you add that on to, was it Twitter, who deleted the President of the United States, his account, even while, Trump I'm talking about, even while he was still president, they deleted him off their Twitter, I mean, again, extraordinary arrogance of these people. And I just can't be having it. And I've had enough of Facebook. I've been very angry with them for a while now because of their attitude towards personal privacy and data, that they read your letters, that anything that you've posted there. Or, when you send messaging using their messaging service or anything like that, they scan it, they get details about you, they take your, they look at the pictures you've got and add them to a picture library for face recognition. They get your address, your birthday, your relations, your children, your wife, your husband, who you're related to, all your friends. And they take all this data, which you thought you were putting up there to share with your friends. They share it with their friends, who are advertisers in the main, but it might be to other people. We don't know. They could be sharing this with anyone who pays. So I can't be living with that. But this latest thing where they've decided they can tell the government of Australia what to do, that's the last straw for me. I've left them. So I'm looking into alternatives. I've already got a little account with gab.com. And I think I'm going to develop that. That seems to be a good alternative to Facebook, one that goes in for free speech, doesn't collect all your data and sell it off. So I'm going to go with that. Meanwhile, I've also got a Rumble channel, partly as a backup. I mean, I don't think Google is as bad as Facebook, but they certainly do data mine. They do take your details. So I think we all need backups, and I've got a backup on rumble.com. Under the name of my channel, though, is The Invisible College. And you'll find I've already put up some of the videos that I recorded on the Book of Daniel and on evolution. I shall be adding to those, and I'm going to continue with the Book of Revelation lectures that I've been doing, quite long lectures. We've got about 15 on here, on Google. I will gradually transfer those over as well. But if you want to carry on watching that series, then you'll need to engage with me on Gab from now on, because I'm not going to put those ones on Google. I'll just put these short lectures on Google and see how we go with that. But I've got no confidence that they won't just suddenly decide to switch off this channel. So we'd need to have a backup. And if you're interested in my work, I do suggest that you come at least register with the Invisible College channel on rumble.com. And that way, if we do get switched off, I mean, at the moment, it's all been about politics, hasn't it? And I don't sort of do lectures on politics, so I'm exempt from that. But you know what they say about first they came for the dissidents, and then they came for the Catholics, and then they came for the Jews, and then they came for you. It's the same thing, I think, with these big tech companies. That they start off, marginalizing people they see as easy targets, and before long they end up marginalizing Australia. What chance do we have? So anyway, that's all I wanted to say on that. Come and join me on Rumble, and we'll carry on with our lecture here. So now, the three ways. Now I'm sure you're all familiar with this figure, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. It shows how man is the measure of all things. So I think it was Marsilio Ficino wrote that in the time of the Renaissance, and Leonardo was trying to demonstrate that with the square and the circle, and how the proportions of the human body fit in with that. But other people have been studying the human and the human body and the human potential. And one of those was this gentleman here, G.I. Gurjev. Now, during the course of these lectures, I'm going to introduce you to a number of teachers of one sort or another. And I'll leave it to you if you want to go and follow further what they said. I'm going to extract little bits and pieces from what I've learnt from different people. He's one of them. And I'm going to share with you what I've learnt from those people. I'm not a disciple of Gurdjieff. I'm not a disciple of anyone, actually, other than Jesus Christ. But I have studied their works, and I use and adapt what I find useful for me. But if you want to go further and deeper into that, that will be down to you. Anyway, this gentleman, G.I. Gurdjieff, he was half Greek, half Armenian, lived, as you can see, 1866 to 1948. He sort of came to prominence in the West just after the First World War. He had been in Moscow and St. Petersburg at the outbreak of the war, and then he and some of the people working with him, I suppose you call them his students, they went to Tbilisi, or Tiflis as he calls it, on the Black Sea at the time of the revolution, the Russian Revolution. And then when things got a bit hot there as well, they moved on to Istanbul, or as it was then called, Constantinople. And from there, he moved to Paris, and he had a school in Paris around the 1920s. So he was an esoteric teacher, half Armenian, half Greek, who had spent a lot of time traveling in the East, particularly in Turkestan, Uzbekistan, all those sort of stan places, and going on towards China and India. And he brought back various teachings, what he called esoteric teachings that he had learnt in certain monasteries while he was there. And I'm going to introduce you to some of what he had to say. Now, he looked at man as being a kind of a three-box unit, the three parts of the body, and you can see that yourself. You have below your diaphragm, you've got all those digestive organs, the intestines and the stomach and all of that, and the liver. I suppose the liver spans into the chest as well. You've got the spleen and the pancreas, all those things which digest food. So the food goes into your mouth, it goes down into the stomach, and it gets digested down there. So that's kind of like the first box for the transformation of energies within the human body. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in other lectures. The second box is the chest. And in the chest, you've mainly got the lungs and the heart. And the lungs, are for bringing in the air. The air comes in through your nose and mouth into your lung, and it oxygenates your blood, which the heart then pumps around. So that's kind of, he would refer to the air as your second being food. The first being food is what you munch up and swallow into your stomach. The second being food is the air that comes into your lungs and oxygenates your blood, and then that's spread around your body. And then the third box is up here, it's your head, and most of your sensory organs are in your head. You know, you've got your eyes, obviously the most important organs of sight, your ears for hearing, your nose for smelling, your mouth for tasting, and you also have got sensation of touch in the the skin and surface of your head as well as the rest of your body. So he would say that that brings in your third being food, which is sensations. And these three combined together are what run the human body. And we'll go into a lot more about that later on. But for now, I just want you to look and see here on this diagram how the moving center, as he would call it, is centered in your solar plexus area in your abdomen. And a lot of what you do is actually automatic. You don't have to think about it. It's like when you're riding a bicycle, you're not thinking about riding a bicycle or driving a car. You're not thinking about, you know, how you change gears or, you know, how you work the brake. You've learnt that and it's gone into your moving center and you do it automatically. And most of what we do is actually automatic. And then in your chest area is where your heart is, and the heart is not just a pump. There's also this sense that it receives emotion and feels emotion. And the feeling sense of us is very much centered in our heart. It's also connected with our throat, but in that area is where, you know, we have the emotional center of feeling. And then the third one is in the head, the thinking sense. Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? We do most of our thinking with our heads. You know, when you're working out mathematics or math, I think you call it in America, and you're thinking and plotting and planning and working things out, and, you know, we do all that with our heads, and we read books, we take in the information off the page, the written words, and we take that in and we process and digest it in our heads. So what he was saying here is that there are these three centers which pretty much run us. And it's not something I think that he's the only one to have come across or to have worked out. It's actually, I found this English philosopher, Robert Fludd, who lived in the late 16th and early 17th century. He's actually buried not all that far from where I live, and there's a statue of him there. So he was a Kentish man like me. And Fludd wrote some remarkable books. He was quite clearly, I think, an enlightened person in the real sense of the word. He was an initiate, without a doubt. I have no doubt whatever about that, from having studied his work, which was prolific. You see him referred to as the last of the Renaissance men. Well, I don't think that really does him justice. This guy was very intelligent, and he had a very active way of seeing things and working things out and seeing the deeper meaning of things. He was also a devout Christian, believed in God, and was an alchemist, and understood that alchemy was really not just about transforming lead into gold. It's about the alchemy of the person. I've mentioned a little bit peripherally already about how these different parts of our body process different energies. So he was into all of that. So an English philosopher of the 17th century wrote a number of books. And these books are published actually by Theodore de Bry in Frankfurt in 1621. The de Bry company is famous for their publishing in that period of the early 17th century. I think they originally came from Holland, the Netherlands, and settled down there in Heidelberg, or that area. But anyway, they're very important in the development of thought, and particularly alchemy and hidden alchemy. But again, I shall go into more of that later as we progress with this series. So in Robert Fludd's philosophy, he splits the body into three parts, just like Gurjev does. So you can see here the natural resources, he calls them, naturalis facultas. His books are written in Latin, so unless you're good at Latin, you probably won't be able to read them. But there are translations of some bits that you can find here and there. Second part, he calls life, vita. So that associates with the heart center, the emotions. And then he puts intellect in the head. Well, yes, intellect is to do with thinking and the intellect. Interestingly, he places outside of the body mind, mens, which is an interesting concept, the idea that the mind is not actually inside the body. We tend to think that our brain, all our memories and so on, are stored inside our brain. But that's not necessarily the case. And he suggests that the mind is actually outside of the body. Now, people fall into three categories depending on which center dominates. This is something that Gurdjieff was into. So you have a thinking center dominant, an emotional center dominant, or a moving center dominant. And, we each of us fall into one or another of these categories. Everyone we know in ordinary life will fit into one or other of these categories. Sporty people are most likely belong to category 1, body-centered. Social justice warriors, I put that in because that's kind of very emotional people, very emotional, very, very fixed in what they like and what they dislike. You might not agree with them, and as far as they're concerned, you're the devil if you don't. But very emotional, although nothing to do with any kind of religion or any kind of belief in an afterlife or anything like that. That's when the emotions are not tied that way. Philanthropists, another group, very emotional people. Philanthropy means love of man or love of mankind. And they're the do-gooders of the world. And they're usually very emotional people. Yeah, that's what stirs them up. Priests. Well, mostly, I know priests actually can be quite a mixture of people, but the whole idea of working through the emotional center is very much the way that organized religion, and I'm thinking particularly here about Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox, where there's a lot of singing and a lot of chanting. Those things work particularly on the emotional center. Monks, they tend to be emotional people working again on the emotional center, the love of God and the desire for beauty, the love of beauty. Poets, again, most poetry, if it's any good, is designed to stir up the emotions and for you to feel it. If you want to transmit ideas, you do it through prose. You don't do it through poetry. The reason you do it in a poetic way is to give an emotional power to what you're saying that's not contained if you just wrote it out in prose. So number 2 types tend to be emotionally centered. And then scientists, philosophers, architects, critics and professors will most likely be type 3, centered in the intellect. Well, that follows, doesn't it? I mean, to be a scientist, you've got to be very analytical. You're working things out with your brain, with your mind. It's no use sort of trying to feel what an earthworm feels. You probably put it under a microscope and dissect it. Trying to work out with your mind how that earthworm is behaving and what that tells you about adrenaline or something. Philosophers the same way. Philosophers analyze thought. They analyze the way that we think and what we think about and about the logic or illogic of it. Architects, well, people who are drawing very careful diagrams. It's no use having... I suppose architects do have an emotional thing as well in that they're looking for the beauty of what they do. but they have to be very mentally disciplined to be able to execute what it is that their vision and bring it into reality. Critics, well, the very nature of critics or criticism is analytic. But again, I guess there can be emotional critics who just do everything on like and dislike. And your typical university professor, well, he's going to be much more likely to be a thinking type than one of the other types. Although, again, I have to admit, you do get teachers, professors who are very sporty, for example. So it's not totally cut and dried. This whole thing about the three types is not cut and dried. There are overlaps, obviously, but we're looking at predominance in a person, and we're going to each of us fall into one context or another predominantly as our major center that we use. We've all got all of these centers and other ones too, but we tend to take on the world with the center that we feel most comfortable with and strongest in. It's like when you're playing bridge, you want to play with your strong suit. You don't want to be playing with a suit you've only got two of clubs or something. You want to play with the ones that you've got an ace and a king. So you're going to do better. And it's the same in life, and that's kind of how we behave. Now, in general, there are three accepted ways towards self-development, and this is where we come back to Gurdjieff. And he called these, number one, the way of the fakir. And I should just say that when he talks about a fakir is a person, you find them in India, and of course he'd been to India. These people who lie on a bed of nails, or they sort of spend their whole life with one arm upstretched, standing there naked in the street. They torture their body, and they struggle with their body to make it do things that it doesn't really want to do, but they continue with that to build up their willpower and crystallize something inside themselves, crystallize their resolve, so that there will be something in them that can survive death. And this is what this is all talking about. It's actually about, from Christian point of view, it is all to do with developing the wedding garment. But again, that belongs in later lectures, excuse me. And the second way is the way of the monk. Now, when he talks about the monk, he's really talking about the way of devotion. That a monk in particular, or a nun, I guess, if it's a lady, they're dealing in devotion, but also obedience. They put themselves under the obedience of the abbot or the Reverend Mother, and they give up their own will, and they are very devotional. They'll get up, go and say their prayers and sing in the chapel so many times a day, and they'll get up during the night, out of their bed and go and say more prayers. Their life is lived a discipline of praying and devotional absorption within the context of their religion. And I think that applies to Buddhism and Hinduism and other religions too, have something equivalent. And that appeals particularly to people who are following the way of the heart and the sort of love of Jesus, the love of Mary, the Mother of God. All of this falls into that category of devotional worship, which is the way of the monk. And then the third way he calls the way of the yogi. Now, when you mention yoga or yogi today, he's writing this back in the 1920s, when it wasn't, people in the West were not so familiar with the concept of yoga. And we tend to think of yoga in terms of hatha yoga, which is, getting into all those postures and stretches and so on. And you go to yoga classes and they teach you them. Well, that's really more to do with way number one, the way of the body. But there are also other kinds of yoga which are to do with the mind and mentation and meditation and focusing the mind. And that's really what he's talking about. And I think that in our day, we wouldn't really use those terminologies. To be away, these have to be taken to much greater lengths than they are in general life. Well, of course that's true, isn't it? I mean, normally speaking, we don't torture our body to be able to keep a hand up in the air all the time, and we don't spend our life as a monk on his knees praying 5 times a day or whatever they do, singing and chanting in the chapel all the time. And we don't spend our time in meditation or focusing and working with the mind the way that a yogi would have done in India in the 1920s. We do use our faculties, but not to that same extent. So I think this is rather confusing terminology, but essentially it means 1, the way of the body, overcoming the reluctance of the body to exert itself beyond the minimal. And number 2, the way of the heart, overcoming selfishness while seeking to serve God through love of others. And then the way of the mind, developing the intellect as an instrument for exploring truth forensically and thereby exposing false. So we can see that in our ordinary life we don't push things to that extent, but if you're going to follow a way, and this terminology means a way of self-development, then you have to go further than that. And I think we do get some idea of what this means if we look at it from our own point of view. So here's an exercise you can do. What types are your family and friends? Right, so which one of them is physical? So look around at your family and friends and yourself and see which centers predominate with them. So have a look. Are they physical? Someone who's very sporty wants to go running and joins the local gym. Goes jogging every day. Very sporty. That is someone who's centered in their moving center. And are they emotionally based? The people who like and dislike have strong feelings about things, strong passions about things, and tend to demonize one thing as bad and glorify something else as good. These kind of divisions show someone who's emotionally based in their heart chakra, or their heart center, you could call it in Christian terms. And we need to develop love and try to get over our hate. Try to get over this sense of everything being polarized. But do you know people who are like that, who are very emotional? And then there's the intellectuals, people who are cool, calm and collected, but somewhat cold maybe, from the perspective of someone who's emotional. And there might also be someone who physically is very inactive and rather lazy, and they don't like going out running and lifting weights. They'd much rather be reading books. That is the person who's centered in their mind, the intellectual. So you look at your own family and friends and try to see what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses. And the chances are that most of the people that are your friends are likely to be similar to yourself. Because like attracts like. Yes, I know, like opposites attract too, but that's a different thing. And you tend to want to hang out with people who are like yourself. So you'll find that there can very likely be a reflection of you. Now, Gurjev himself taught what he called the fourth way, which is to say combining all the other three. And he actually went further than this, but very few people have understood this. And we'll go into that subject in later lectures. But for now, try to identify which is your own type. Recognize the strengths and limitations of this type. So I know, there's far more to be said on all of this. We're only just touching very lightly on a very big subject here. But we have to start off, I know some people say, well, I know all that already. But we have to start off at the beginning. There's no use rushing forwards. So I'd like you to just think about that and think about looking at the world from this perspective of types, and also notice when you yourself are in your emotional center, you're feeling very strongly about something, or else you're in your head and you're being very objective and cool and rational about things, or you're rushing to do something and you're sort of being very moving centered, when quick moving and not thinking, just doing. And that's, notice when you're in that center. We all move around from one to another, although we have one which we feel most comfortable in. So thank you again for listening. Please come and join me on Rumble. We're going to do much, much more if you're interested. And as I say, I have no confidence that it couldn't be wiped off Google tomorrow. It could happen. So if you are interested in this work, come to Rumble and register yourself there, so that should things disappear, and because if Google takes me off, then anyone who's been subscribing to this channel, I don't know who you are. I have no connection with you, and that will be lost. So thank you again, and I wish you well.